Hello, and welcome to this discussion. Angela and I are going to be talking about Kore, above ground Persephone, today, which we've been chatting for weeks. I think we're always talking about Persephone in one way or the other. Don't you?
Yeah. I mean, it's hard to avoid, really, like, because everything, she's so cyclical as a story. She just weaves into everything.
She does. She finds her way. So before we get in, I just wanted to make a couple of notes. One is that the story of Persephone will be talking about her mythology, that it does contain themes of trauma, sexual violence, you could say misogyny, and so on, that there's a lot of difficult, heavy themes in this story. So if that doesn't feel safe for you right now, you may want to not listen. Take good care of yourself. At times, Angela and I may make jokes about the heaviness of some of the aspects of what we're talking about. Please know that that is just our coping mechanism that helps us to deal with the heaviness, because a lot of the heaviness in the story is also related to experiences that we personally had. And we both tend to use jokes as a coping mechanism. The other thing I want to mention before we dive in is that this story, of course, is very gendered. The story of the young maiden, Corey, who goes down to the underworld and marries Hades, the Dark Lord, and then is reunited with her mother. And all the while is aided by Hecate as a sort of mediator, auntie, or crone figure that helps. So it's a very women focused story, and it is very much the story of a young girl who transforms to queen and then kind of comes back into her own wholeness and surfaces. At the same time, the themes go beyond uh, like gendered experience. And I invite you to see this as a story about exploring what is archetypally feminine, which would be intuition, the journey of wholeness rather than the hero's journey, a journey that involves navigating complex power structures that are stacked against you. So, it's not a story for women only. And just to be clear, when we talk about maiden, mother, and potentially crone, we're not talking about like the physiological stages of someone who identifies as a woman. We're talking about them from an archetypal perspective, and connecting to the archetypal feminine or the anima is always about the what's more intuitive, what's more emotional, what's the feeling function, what's connected to the natural rhythm of the world, what's connected to the world beyond. And, we can, of course, discuss whether that's an accurate definition or not, but we're going into this conversation using that definition of talking about the archetypal feminine, and that the archetypal feminine is for everybody and exists in everybody, no matter what gender you may identify with in the here and now. I do think it's important to kind of preface a story like that with something, saying like it's not just about the mother, is not just doesn't just apply to people who've had children. It's a phase of life, it's an archetype. It's the one who is reproducing, producing.
Yeah, and
You
it's
don't.
also the caregiver. It's very much the caregiver state. I was just talking to a friend today she's always wanted children. She doesn't have them now, but her mother is now ill, and
Mm.
she's finding herself in this caregiver state. We're also just like a parent, she can't be spontaneous. She can't really plan because she needs to be there for her mother. So it is very much it's a state in your life.
That's such a good point. And the other thing is, like, I believe, like, at stages in our life, we are more or less like occupied by one of these archetypes of maiden, mother, crone. And also, like, it's not a pure archetype. Like, you could be, she could be a mother in that capacity, but like as a scholar, perhaps she's, much more like the maiden, the beginner mind, approaching, like, so, and then maybe in another relationship, we could be more like a crone, like the wise auntie figure or medicine woman who is there to give advice and counsel and support. Um, but it's not her story. Like like if you look at the mythology of Persephone, like it's not Hecate's story.
Yeah.
She's there to help out. It is Persephone and Demeter's story, whether you're talking about like the Homeric Hymn version of it or the version in Ovid's Metamorphoses. You know, it's like a story that is equally about daughter and mother,
Mm-hmm.
even though it's called a Homeric Hymn to Demeter, because, Demeter as a figure was, was the mother. And in the area like where, um, the story would have been first told, she was really understood as the great mother figure and Persephone as the daughter.
Yeah.
So, there's that idea that it is, even though it's about Persephone's journey, and I think like here and now, we really focus more on Persephone's story instead of like Demeter's story. Like, like it's like we want to, I don't know, I'm old enough to kind of be like have grown up during like the early stages of Wicca becoming popular in North America. So like in the 80s and 90s, all of this about Persephone, like there was a lot of emphasis on Persephone
Mm-hmm.
and a lot of emphasis on Persephone as the maiden.
Yes.
Um, and a lot of emphasis on the maiden as being like a young woman, like very nubile, very sexual, very all of these things. Um, when I based on what I've studied in the years since, like to the ancients who would have been telling these stories and performing the rites, it was much more complicated than that. That was just part of what it meant to be Kore. And for
Exactly.
Demeter, the fact that she was associated with like civilization and agriculture is just part of her story, because to them this was like the myth and the rituals at Eleusis. They were connected to the personal journey, the life
Mm.
journey we went on, and also like the seasons, and
Mm.
they were all connected and really layered,
Yeah.
um, and
Also,
woven together, right?
yeah, and I think this is also a good time to introduce this idea that it's always really hard to, we've talked about this before, to project the ways that we've been conditioned to think
Mm-hmm.
from a Western perspective onto this time, because the Greek concept of like the way that the Greeks would have interacted with the story is really different from how we interact with it today. Like for the average Greek, the soul was an exterior idea, like most of your soul is outside of you. And there are, I believe, 5 different types of it. So when you're interacting with a story like this, you're understanding it intuitively from multiple levels. It's a story about mother and daughter, but they're also gods, but they're also concepts, but they're also times in your life metaphorically, but they're also times in your life literally sometimes. And they're also stories about like what happens like in a larger sense, like to the culture, like cycles of culture. And
Mm-hmm.
also cycles of the seasons, like you mentioned. And it's also, I think it was Charlene Spretnak who said this, it's also the story of what happened to Greece itself,
Mm-hmm.
right? Like the abduction of Persephone is very much the story of like this like northern tribe coming in and sort of raping Greece itself, like this region itself, and appropriating its storytelling. So I don't know, like when we talk about myth, it bears all of these layers, like land or like trees, like tree rings, but it's also containing a lot of vestiges of trauma and also things that happened before, especially in an oral storytelling culture where these stories mutate based on how memory changes, how the storyteller has a preference, what the culture requires at a given time. And just to return to what you said, like there tends to be a really strong focus on Persephone in our culture. That could be for a lot of reasons, right? Like to start with, we're a literary culture, and the way that we've sort of like ossified this story is really focused on Persephone. So it doesn't change the way that, you know, or as quickly, at least, it doesn't change as often as it did in an oral storytelling culture. But it is also kind of representative of, I think, something that we're all trying to deal with and work on as a culture, because myth is it's medicine, right? Like it's very heal or harm. So what you attach to in a myth says something about what you're working on inside. And maybe this is also something that we're just like working on, this idea of this really particular focus on the maiden, you know, at the expense of all else. But it does do a disservice to the myth at large, because it's not the myth at large.
Right. And I think, you know, we certainly live in like a youth obsessed culture.
Mm.
And you know, it kind of makes sense that we like ignore the fact that it's actually the Homeric hymn to Demeter. It's not the hymn to Persephone. You know, it's like, oh yeah, that's what it's called. But you know, we're youth obsessed as a culture, so let's pay attention to what the maiden in this story is doing and ignore the mother, which as a mother, sometimes it feels very, very personal. Okay, so before we get, so we're going to dive in deep. So get yourself comfortable. If you have a candle, you might want to join me in lighting a candle. I know, Angela, you're in residency at the uni.
Yeah.
So can you have a
If I
candle
light a
or not?
candle, if I light a candle, this fire alarm just above me is going to go off.
I
This
will
room.
light the candle.
Okay, thank
Do
you.
not want Angela causing an uproar while
Mhm.
she's in
Yes.
college. So there's our candle. So come on in. Let's do the counterclockwise symbolic movement to cleanse. Yeah, you can use your hands. Your hands are powerful. Your hands are the most powerful thing. You are. And then let's go in the clockwise circle to protect. And then we offer you this blessing of this discussion about above ground Persephone, which is a note we should make. So Angela and I have made many, many recordings of talking about Persephone, because Persephone, Demeter, and Hecate really are the trio upon which, like, I based what we do in
Yeah.
Covina.
Yeah.
So we've made many videos talking about it, but we've never done just a class on like above ground Persephone. Um, and in the fall, we always do Persephone, which, so I think it's like, okay, let's just stop. I don't know, we wouldn't have a train if we're back in ancient Greece. Let's just stop the cart here, um, and pause for a moment and let's break it down about Kore, Persephone, like names. I think because talking about names in these myths is important. So
Mhm.
maybe you can start by talking a little bit about what Kore actually means and how you spell it. I think that's always good to start at the beginning.
Sure. Yeah. Kore. So Kore is Kore. Very commonly, it's understood to represent the maiden. It's also used to like in reference to, you know, those statues of what are most likely priestesses in classical temples, but are often, you know, like people like to say that they're servants because that's how people read things. They're
Right.
probably so Kore, it's sort of like the maiden, the nameless one, but also it also means shoot. And I think at this point in the discussion, it merits mentioning that quite often in a lot of these tellings of the story of what happened to Persephone, Persephone is kind of operating as a concept, and not all of them have this narrative of like a Zeus and Hades kind of like having this secret conversation to kidnap her. There's another narrative that's a lot more focused on the shoot idea, where Gaia, who's the, you know, the elemental goddess of creation, is the main orchestrator of this situation. It merits mentioning at this point that Gaia is the daughter of she's directly descended from chaos, isn't she?
Mm-hmm.
So this is like a great moment to mention, like there's a very close relationship between chaos and creation. Um, so Gaia plants the narcissus that attracts Kore, as she's sort of like moving through the fields. Kore, the daughter of Demeter, of course. And when she plucks the narcissus, when she ends their lives, she tumbles into the underworld. And that's such a beautiful moment to start with. You know, like there's something so resonant in the idea of like this sort of feckless youth,
Mm-hmm.
and this idea of like tumbling into your first underworld as a result of interaction with Narcissus, you know. Like there's so much that you
So
read.
much there. There's so much.
Yeah. Yeah, it could be a guy, it could be yourself, like your own fascination. It could be so many things that moment. So she tumbles into the underworld, and this kind of this seed of, you know, this direct seed of Demeter, this piece of glowing life and potential. She becomes the bride of Hades, who symbolizes the underworld and death, which in the Greek mind was not a punishment or a finality as we understand it now. Death is the place where all of life begins again, and it transforms and it returns, you know? And so there's very much this idea that the seed and the death and the earth, they have to unite in order to produce the shoots that nourish the land. And so that's one telling that's in direct relation to the name Kore.
So by shoot, you mean like little like green shoots, like just
Yes,
starting out plants.
exactly.
Okay.
Mm.
So Kore, or you can, I mean, Kori, Kora,
Kore, yeah,
Karina,
Kora.
so many versions of this,
Mm.
but it comes from this ancient title for a young girl, or like a shoot, like a freshly growing shoot. So I love how you pointed out that like Persephone is a concept in the myth.
Mm.
So she starts out as this naive girl who plucks the narcissus, and of course, you know, here we are over like 2,500 years later, and you know, it's associated with also like the figure Narcissus in mythology, but we, you know, we have like this whole psychopathological understanding of narcissism. And then
Mm.
there's also, you know, what we call healthy narcissism, which is how much self-aggrandizement we have like as a personality trait, which is a certain amount of thinking that we're good and being taking pride in our accomplishments is a good thing.
Mm-hmm.
So, you know, like that concept of narcissism has also endured like from this myth, but also other myths, and how the ancients in that area of the Mediterranean would have under like the symbolism that was hinged on the narcissus flower. So, you know, there's that. And then there's also, I think she was in the fields of Nisa or Nissa. So
Mm.
Nissa also means like tipping point. So in a
Mm.
modern perspective, it's like, you know, Persephone was hanging out, you know, at, I guess you would say like at the mall, and, you know, got seduced by like a
Yeah,
narcissist,
cool guy. Yeah.
the cool guy, and ended up in trouble.
Mm.
Um, and you know, because the mall, like as a place, so it's interesting when you try to make a parallel today, because like you said, myths are alive and they reiterate in different ways. So sometimes we get actual retellings. I think in the Percy Jackson YA series, you know, I think I haven't read all of the books. Like Aiden read some of them, and I've read some of them when he was younger. I read some of them to him. Um, so I'm not an expert. If there's a Percy Jackson expert listening, feel free to comment and let us know what actually happens with Persephone in the series. So like that way, but also like there's always like pop culture iterations
Mm.
of the maiden who has to go on the underworld journey and
Yeah.
then gets reborn, whether she becomes the above ground Persephone. But I
Yeah.
think I want to just stop for a second, and because you started talking about Corey, what Corey means, I want to
Mm,
also talk about Persephone and what Persephone means.
mm,
So Corey is new life, the shoot, the beginning, and Persephone means the destroyer, death, the end. So in a sense, like she doesn't even have a name
mm.
because she's either the beginning, the shoot, the
Either
newness,
beginning or ending.
or
Yeah.
she's the beginning or the ending. She doesn't get her own name.
Mm,
Like, so it's interesting to know like what her two titles are,
yeah.
and that who she is really like the daughter or the child of life itself,
Yeah.
and that Demeter is the mother of life itself, and depending on the story, like it's Zeus, whoever Persephone's father is.
Yeah.
Always parentage, like you always need like you need a flow chart to understand how these things work in these Greek myths, right? But so Persephone is life itself. Persephone is all of us,
Yeah.
whatever gender we have. If we go on a journey that is about like you said, tumbling into the underworld at the hands of forces greater than us
Yeah.
and against our will.
Yeah. Yeah,
And
definitely. Yeah, because I also did want to add, like, just because of the particular story that I told, that's definitely not to delegitimize like the abduction or the rape narrative, like that's more commonly told, where like Hades goes out of his way and he kidnaps her. Like that's it's just really to illustrate like the diversity of the myth when it was oral. Yeah. Yeah.
right. I mean, there are different versions of it. And I think like we can agree that the most common one does feature like this abduction and rape,
Mm,
and that it is against her will, which I
mm,
think, I mean, like in our like everyday conversations, you and I talk often about like the hero's journey and Heracles or Hercules. And this is the opposite version of that story,
mm. Yeah. Yeah.
because it all starts with like a girl or a figure, like it could be any gender,
Mm,
who is against their will, um, taken to a place that they didn't want to go, and then what I mean, and then eventually she emerges, having like adapted and become queen of her own trauma.
mm,
She emerges on the other side as victorious, but it's not like the hero's victory.
yeah.
Like, with Persephone, when she does like come out of the underworld. So in the most common version of the myth, there is a deal brokered between different like mythic figures. So, but it's kind of like a committee. So Hecate sometimes, Hermes sometimes, Helios sometimes, Demeter. Like there's a whole committee that forms to go and negotiate with Zeus about whether or not Persephone is actually going to have to go and live in the underworld.
Mm,
Um, and I kind of like this because, in Lympadia, the master course I teach, we do a lot of work with internal family systems, which is this idea that we have many selves. So I like the idea of like when we find ourselves in a difficult situation, like what is our internal committee? Like who is our inner Hermes, the communicator? Who is our inner Hecate, like the wise figure who it's like, this isn't my story. I'm here to help.
yeah.
Helios, who is like, bright and solar, like so, and solar, of course, like in the way I teach it, solar is about like the expressed or external self. So you have like all this committee. It seems very internal family systems to me. What
Mhm.
happens
Yeah.
in this part of the story?
Like Helios going, I saw everything, and Demeter going, where's my daughter? Like
Right?
it's just,
It's like
yeah.
we have all of these figures inside of us. And I think that's really the beauty of like studying mythology, is that we can say like, how am I Helios? How am I Hecate? How am I Demeter? How am I like Kore, going down for the first time? Or am I Persephone, who is in the underworld, like destroying what's harmed me? And then am I the reborn Persephone, who retains that title of Persephone, the destroyer, but gets to go like and be ascended and be, in psychological terms, it's like now she's individuated, so she goes up to Olympus and has nectar, which is lovely.
The great reward.
The great reward, right?
Yeah.
But she spent her time down below, um,
Yeah, exactly.
which is such an analogy for our lives, right? And I also, one of the things that I touch upon, I just like this time, I've been studying this story like for all of my life. I feel like at least 35 years. I don't even
Yeah.
remember when I first fell in love with this story. Um, but something that I've been thinking about a lot is, well, I mentioned briefly the idea that when she emerges, like there's no parade. This isn't Hercules' story.
Yes.
There's no parade. There's no like, here's your golden fleece,
Yeah.
Jason. Like, like there is, it's very anti-hero in the
Mm.
sense of what the Greek myths, like it's a very different story, which
Yeah.
again, we've been reading some scholarly work saying that there's like just describing the evidence that the Homeric hymn to Demeter might have been written by a woman
Mhm.
because it's so different linguistically, but also like thematically, um, that it's not the hero's journey. Like and I think Joseph Campbell really popularized the idea of the hero's journey with his amazing work. But this is a very different story.
Yeah. And it's also the kind of story that regardless of where you're encountering like a story about a woman in like a fairy tale or a folk tale or a mythology, like it's a far more common story for women. Like there's this idea of rather than a kind of like a continuous triumphant ascent, like I don't know, like what we all appreciate, that sort of hero's journey. And also I think that's how we tend to see our lives. um the like the kinds of fairy tales or mythologies about women, they tend to be more about going down, going through death. You can see this in Snow White or Sleeping Beauty. They literally like they enter into a death-like state, if not death. Um, or like the entry into the dark forest. The
Mhm.
dark forest is definitely an underworld metaphor. And I don't know, like I do feel like it does say something about our culture that the hero's journey, like this very solar journey, is a lot more valued and legitimized to us than this idea of well, actually, you might have to go underground. You might have to die, like legitimately die, in order to encounter transformation, in order to change. And this is part of what makes the Persephone and Demeter stories so powerful, because you can't go back from that. Like when a version of you dies, it's a whole version of you. It's not just the bits that you don't like. There's a part of you that mourns. There's a real cost enacted. And as we were talking about just before the podcast started, like this lesson about transformation and renewal that ripples like through us and through the community and to the land, etc. It was so important that it was, like the Eleusinian mysteries, they're observed every year in this time. Like it was something that people had to remember and engage with directly with their bodies.
Right. And I think, maybe we should just unpack a little bit about the connection of like the myth
Yeah.
of Persephone and Demeter with the Eleusinian
Yes.
mysteries, because that's
Yeah.
really important for understanding like the societal context in which, like you said, an oral tradition, the story would have been told orally, and it was part and parcel with these rituals. Like it wasn't separate, much in the same way that um, I guess with Christianity, like the myths around Christianity are part and parcel. Like we're coming up on Easter, so they're part and parcel of Easter celebrations around the world. They're not separate, and they exist in a cultural context. It's a very obviously the resurrection story of Jesus is very different than the Persephone story, and maybe we can even, if we have time, we can touch upon that a little bit, like why the Jesus myth in many sense, like it replaced the Persephone myth,
Mm,
and why the Romans like did that.
mm,
Um, so, but back to Persephone, and so at Eleusis, these rituals were accessible to everybody, anybody who was sincere and could. So Eleusis was a town close to Athens, so anybody who could make this journey, which they didn't have, like it would have been on foot for a lot of them. So it still would have been, even though now it's like, oh, that's 20 miles, that's not far, but on foot, 20 miles is 20 miles.
pretty serious. Yeah.
So even if they were just coming from Athens, it still would have been like a journey.
Mm,
And so they would have stayed for days. It wasn't like they just so it's like a pilgrimage, and I think people still make similar pilgrimages even today, right? Like, so pilgrimages to Mecca, for example, or pilgrimages like to Lourdes.
yeah.
We still do these kind of pilgrimages, but so to think of like the rituals at Eleusis like that they were really important. The story was widely known. The rituals were widely known. They were accessible to anybody who could make it. So, unlike more costly ceremonies and things, these were for everybody. And they endured for about 2,000 years.
Yeah.
So, this wasn't like an obscure festival that was done in one village. And sometimes what happens today when we are looking like we look to the past, we find like a ritual or a figure or something that really resonates, and they were pretty actually obscure in the context of when the stories would have been told for the first time. But the rituals at Eleusis were a big deal, and they were widely known. They happened every year. They were connected to this myth. They were for everybody. So as part of like how religion was practiced, they had different, like we would call them denominations today, probably. It's like Catholics and Protestants and Baptists. I mean, there was like a lot of variety in how religion was practiced over the 2,000 years. But I guess the centrality of this story, kind of, it would have been like widely known. It
Yeah.
wasn't, even if you aren't, for example, a Catholic today,
Yeah.
you probably know a few things about Catholicism,
Yeah.
right?
And also polytheism at this time is really I don't know, like one of the cool things about polytheism is it's quite a promiscuous as well. Like when you're preparing for a journey, you would like if where you're traveling to has different gods, you would also like, respectfully say hello and offer libation to those gods, like even if they're not yours. It was part of the region. And part of like a just what it is to be a respectful stranger as well.
Okay, so that was a bit of an overview about Persephone, different aspects of her. So now we're going to dive into talking more about the Homeric hymn to Demeter itself, and then we'll conclude by talking about imagining, for the most part, what it might have been like when Persephone emerged after her time down below. So if we're just getting the slideshow going because we have some amazing statues and such of Persephone.
Mm.
Um, and also, how did that happen? Sorry about that. Okay, so before we dive in, I just wanted to make a note. We're talking about like above ground Persephone. So Kore before she went into the underworld, and Kore when she emerged. And we're saving a big discussion for Persephone as queen of the underworld for the fall. Though if you're in Covina, just type Persephone into the search bar, and there is so much that you'll find, and other classes as well. Just to connect this month's explorations to last month's talk about Semele,
Bless
excuse
you.
me, and Dionysus. Um, that below ground Persephone, queen of the underworld, wife of Hades, Dionysus actually goes to her to seek her favor to help restoring Semele and making Semele a goddess. So there's that whole aspect. So there's a continuance that these myths are all connected. And, like if you get a copy of the Homeric hymns, or if you get a copy of Ovid's Metamorphoses, you can start to really understand how they're all woven together, and they're not standalone stories. It's like, I guess today, the Marvel universe is really popular. A lot of people might know all those characters. And if you kind of think of like these story, like there were characters like in the Marvel universe with endless offshoots that apparently are all on Netflix or the Disney Channel, that every week there's like a new story, but they're all kind of part of the same universe and interconnected. I guess Star Wars is kind of like that today too.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
So reading the whole stories will give you a more fleshed out understanding of the mythic universe that these characters all lived in. So Corey, um, we're using the translation of the Homeric hymns by Diane Rayer. I like to use more modern translations. In the Keeping Your Keys book, I relied on like the more more traditional translations of different things when I was writing about Hecate, just to kind of give a context. But there are a lot of modern translations of these ancient texts happening by people of our time and with our context and with our societal values, and they're casting a very different light over these ancient texts compared to some of the more widely known translations, which would have been, for lack of a better word, coming from a more patriarchal perspective, a more like Christian centric view, and like the view that the stories might be beautiful, but they weren't Christian, so therefore flawed. um, so the newer translations are really stepping away from that in important ways. And Angela, like when we were talking earlier, you brought up a really great example of that. So you want to talk a little bit about that? Just, I always want to encourage people to read these things, so it's
Yeah.
like, give a shout out to what you brought up before.
Yeah, definitely. So the first thing that I want to say is I love everything that you said, and my preferred version of the Homeric hymns is the Jules Cashford version, which is also quite modern. But yeah, we were talking about the Odyssey. Like I've read many different versions of the Odyssey, but my absolute favorite version is the Emily Wilson translation, which came out a few years ago. There's a lot to recommend it. To start with, it's not very bloated. She tries to keep the translation, she does actually, line for line the same. So it's really athletic. It just moves and skips, like it just leaps off of the page. But she also, just because of her particular approach and where she is and where we are in the world, and even the fact that she's a woman, there are translation decisions, contextual translation decisions that she makes, that were kind of largely ignored or wouldn't have been made by previous mostly male translators. She will emphasize, for example, that a lot of the servants were in fact slaves, or like, she'll talk about like the thickness of Penelope's hands. And that's a really big deal because Penelope was a weaver. This was the thickness of your hands, like that was really a strength in a woman, like in a very particular feminine strength. So she doesn't ignore that in favor of like more of like a softness and a demureness that other translators might focus on instead. So yeah, translation, modern translation, really important. A lot of like really exciting things are happening in terms of just conversations that we're having like that in our time with these texts.
So, and for some reason, when you talk about like her hands, it's also in this myth, but in other stories, there's this reference to having beautiful ankles. Uh, that is, a common theme. And there's even like an epithet that's applied, I think, to Persephone, Hecate, Demeter, and I think also maybe Artemis at least, but many of them, probably Aphrodite as well, which is Phoenicopisa basically in English, which means, she of ruddy feet. But because there's this
Oh,
whole thing about like goddesses having really nice feet and ankles
hmm.
because, like the average, I guess, person would maybe not have such nice feet and ankles. And because, that they were special because, they had nice feet and ankles. And even now, like, I don't know, when I think of this whole business with the feet and ankles and the hands, it's like hand models
Yeah.
or, um, like how much many people admire like women in high-heeled shoes.
Mm,
So I
yeah.
think in a way we're still like into the whole hands and feet, especially the ankles, in terms of like women walking around in these shoes, which like do nothing. You can't actually walk in them, but they do highlight like that you have really shapely and attractive ankles and lower legs, right? So I think we're still, in a sense, like kind of into like the things they talk about, which seem kind of strange when you step back and say, oh yeah, that is still living in society today,
Oh,
right?
do you want to know a weird fact about foot modeling?
Always.
So there was this guy, he was a modeling agent. So he was talking to me about like, not to me because he thought I should be a foot model, because nobody thinks that. He was just talking about the fact of foot modeling. And he said what people who want a good foot model are looking for is is a good like fleshy back of foot so that you can't see the veins, and toes that look like little shrimp. Like I don't know why, I will never forget that he said that. Toes that look like little shrimp.
Okay. So it was probably the same when the ancients were recording like their myths and talking about the goddesses with these beautiful ankles. Like ankles, it's always been a thing.
Yeah,
Feet,
they were
ankles,
the toes that look like little shrimp of that time.
that's right. Um, and if you're watching this instead of listening to it, you can see on this slide this really beautiful statue of Persephone. So this is a more mature version, not a Kore statue. We've got some slides of Kore statues. And I love this and the fact that some of the paint still remains.
Yeah.
Um, and since the paint on many of the statuary from the ancient figures like doesn't still remain, we tend to, it's almost like a parallel to the way we can like not really give the myths like their proper breathing room to work on us. It's like we try to sanitize them like those statues that are just plain white marble. We try to do the same thing with the myths, when in fact the myths were beautiful, multicolored, and complex the way these statues would have been originally as well. So
Yeah.
she's really beautiful and stunning.
Yeah,
And
I love this vivid pink. Like it really lends a like the sense that the statuary, like when seen everywhere, alongside the temples, because the temples were also painted as well. It was a really psychedelic effect. It was
right,
very rich. Yeah,
it was very vibrant. It was alive. Like it wasn't sanitized. It wasn't flat.
yeah.
It was very, very colorful.
Mm.
A couple of notes from the introduction to this version of the Homeric hymns. She talks about um, some of the unique features of the hymn to Demeter or Demeter or Demeter, whatever you prefer, however you prefer saying these things is fine with me. Um, I tend to say Demeter, though sometimes it comes out Demeter. Um, so she talks about this role about Demeter's limitations and then her strength and Persephone's kind of reemergence, is eventual reemergence, but it's only after a time in the underworld. Um, and then she brings in some scholarship. I guess it's semantics. I don't know what specifically the area would be called for trying to suss out who wrote ancient things. But the idea of like analyzing text to figure out the gender of who might have written something, which is kind of an interesting rabbit hole that I've fallen into a few times. And here she points out that there is some evidence that different scholars say that perhaps the hymn to Demeter was written by a woman. And I've also run into this theory that parts of the Greek magical papyri were also written by a woman. So it kind of links back to, like, look at the translation you're working with. There's many different, it's not that one is wrong and one is right, but look at the context of who the translator is and their time. Because, like older translations have male gaze, and they want the authors to all be male. They don't want any diversity, because that was who they were. They were of their times. It's not that it was right or wrong, they were of their times.
Yeah.
But here
Yeah.
she's really advocating this idea that perhaps the Homeric hymn to Demeter and the hymn to Aphrodite were potentially written by women, and even Sappho, which I find is a very interesting idea that kind of, you can feel it kind of shaking up the status quo.
Yeah, yeah. I really like that you brought that up because it is something that merits saying, like the Iliad and the Odyssey, like there's a lot of evidence that points to that these things were not written by one single person. Like it was a series of, like many different tellings compiled, like maybe even by a committee of different sort of like people in the bardic tradition. And it's the same is true for the Homeric hymns. So like I always think this is quite revolutionary because like we do have this tendency to think like, oh, it's just been men all the way through, but actually we don't know. Like that's a very local bias in space and time.
Definitely. Okay, so move on a little bit. So here, if you're watching with us, this is a Peplos Kore. So this is what a Kore statue would have looked like. And like Angela, you mentioned earlier, like Kore was, like they were priestesses, they were attendants, acolytes, whatever you want to call them. So Kore was like a role, as
Yeah.
it's not just her name in the story. Kore is a role, and there's many Kore statues, and so this is one wearing the peplos, and you can see a little bit of the paint remaining on her as well. So
Mm.
these are there's a couple more points that we wanted to pull out from the introduction to this version of the Homeric hymns. It's talking here about a really challenging idea, I think, for us in the 21st century, is the closeness of death, marriage, and becoming a mother. That for a maiden on the cusp of these things, as Kore is in this story, that they were all really close. Which I think nowadays, like we just don't associate getting married with death, and we don't associate childbirth with death, especially in the West. Like these things do not equate in death because they've changed. um so Angela, I know you have some really interesting thoughts on this whole business and why, like how we can kind of reconnect to what the authors of, like what the meaning of this myth is in terms of this close association with death.
Yeah, definitely. Really quickly though, fun fact, it is true that in the storytelling of like what we like to tell ourselves, like there's not an association between these things, like maybe it even feels unlucky. But the United States, for example, has the highest mortality rate in childbirth of any other industrialized country. So in the fact of it, that association is still there, but like to return to the myth for a minute, like I think it's helpful to understand how death was understood, like in the context of the Demeter Persephone story, but like just also in the context of that time. Like death was not considered a punishment or this torture, or like you want to avoid it at all costs. Like this is like also a very recent and new idea. The like it merits saying that even before the Greeks, life and death were always considered sisters. Like if you go back to Sumer, Inanna is life and love, and Eresh Kigal is the queen of death, and they're sisters. They were literally sisters. and this is still true in Greek times, like you require death to create life. And I think there's something really telling about the way that the Eleusinian mysteries are designed, for example, that conveys the sense of when you're entering another season in your life, there is a version of you that has to die. And and that can be quite painful, like and it can also feel literal. And I don't know, like there's something really, sometimes it's not metaphorical, sometimes it's actually what happens. And these two things can have a similar emotional impact. Like here Diane Rayor is talking about how, like, quite often, like, you were married young, and if you started having babies young, like your life was probably over quite quickly. So there's like, and this is also useful to talk about, like, in the context of Easter, and like with thoughts of rabbits in the air, like the idea of life and death is also very close, particularly if you're a woman who's actually producing children with your body. Like there's a saying that I think is very true, and maybe, like, Cindy, you'll correct me because you've had children and I haven't, if it's not true. But like when you're in the state of giving birth, like, you're never actually closer to death most of the time than in that state. Like that threshold between life and death, like it's essentially the same door. So this idea of bride and corpse, like, it sounds really uneasy, I think, in the Western thinking. But it was pretty well understood to the Greeks that these things are two sides of the same coin. They're not always literal, but if you want to pass to another point in your life, especially a critical point, there's a death involved. For a birth, there's a death, and a wedding is also a kind of birth.
Right, for everything gained, something is lost. Like there is a
Exactly.
natural balance.
Yeah.
And when we lean too much towards like just the life, like the gain, the growth, that it gets to be too much and can really result in a lot of distress. And I think psychopathology, physiological health problems,
Yeah.
like when there is too much life, like that's not good. We need to balance it with the fear, like we need to be like Persephone, 2/3 above ground, 1/3 below ground, the two different cycles.
Mm.
I'm sorry,
Bless you.
it's very springy here.
I also have allergies.
Okay, let's move on. So we're going to just work through a few sections of the myth itself that we wanted to highlight. If you can access the Covina Pod Squad playlist, I put a whole recitation of the myth from Liv at Let's Talk About Myth, baby. I can never say that without singing. Um, so there, you'll find that the whole thing being recited there if you want to listen to it because it's so beautiful. Um, the
Ooh.
first thing to kind of know, so we've talked a little bit about what happens at the beginning. There is this initial problem, and then Persephone has to go to the underworld. Demeter is not happy. She really goes into this rage, then she goes into a withdrawal. It's very much like Kubler-Ross's stages of grief. What
Yeah.
Demeter goes through here. There's denial, there's rage, there's acceptance. So in the story, this is explaining both like the personal loss that she experienced, but also like the seasons of the year, that there is this time, like a fallow time. And, like at first, we might not be prepared for when all of this vibrancy is yanked away from us and we can be really like pissed off, and then we can withdraw, and then
Mm.
and well, in Demeter's case, she actually takes on another guise to deal with her loss, right? She pretends to be somebody else. So there's all of this richness that happens in this story because Persephone is just like exit stage left here. She's not in the story. She's left.
And
So
we were talking about how the loss of a child, it's like one of the greatest fears that you can have, right? Is like, it's really traumatic.
it is, and it's hard to like. It's one of those things that's always with you as a parent. That like today, when they go to work or whatever it is they're doing, they might not come back.
Mm.
Or, the whole like checking to make sure they're breathing. Like even now, like every once in a while, I'll have that urge to be like, he's really quiet in there. And then I'm like, no, like he's 17. Respect his privacy. That's weird. You can't go into a 17-year-old's bedroom when they're sleeping.
Well, actually, when I do sleep at my parents, I have noticed this. My father, he will still sneak in at night when he thinks I'm sleeping and just plug in a nightlight. Like, I don't know, because I used to be afraid of the dark when I was a kid, and I think he thinks that I still am, even if I'm almost 40. So it's just a thing that he has to do, I think, or he's not going to feel comfortable.
Right. Well, Demeter is definitely uncomfortable. She rages. So because she is Demeter, the great mother, and um, like the verdant world, the ability of the world to produce. When Demeter goes into withdrawal, that stops
Yeah.
because she is, it's kind of like if mama ain't happy, ain't nobody happy, right? So, so people do try to make Demeter happy. It's all for naught. Anyway, so we wanted just to pull that, like, to say that this is really like at this point in the story, who knows what's going on with Persephone? It's about Demeter's journey to try to right this wrong. It's really a story of secondary trauma at this
Yeah.
point.
Yeah.
Like we don't know. Persephone's not here. Like we don't have her story, but we do have like Demeter talking about and feeling really like the experience of vicarious trauma.
Yeah. And this also emphasizes that close connection between, I don't know, like life and death, like what's happening in the context of wedding and funeral, like, like in modern terms, like the father's last dance with his daughter is a big deal. And it's very much like there's always a sense of tragedy around that.
Right.
Or like in France, like a bachelorette party is called literally a funeral of the young life of the boy, or a funeral of the life of the young girl. Like that's literally what they're called. So there's this. And I'm also thinking about, like, I don't know, like when I was reading the last sentence of this paragraph, both journeyed to a new home led by a procession of family and friends carrying torches with song and dance, blessings, gifts, and a feast. I also thought about Cupid and Psyche, like when Psyche is led up the mountain and everybody is coming with her, and it's like a wedding procession for her and the dragon. And there's that marked moment when they get to the top of the mountain and whoosh, all of the flags turn, and they're from like wedding bright to just black. And then it becomes a funeral right before everybody goes down the mountain because they all know that she's going to die. And that's like a really rough juxtaposition.
So it's this whole I just love that, like in France, it's like we're having a funeral party before you get married because you're bringing death, like death to your maidenhood, death to your youth. You're taking on a role that is more traditionally, it's about more responsibility, it's
Mm,
about procreation, it's about building a family that will contribute to society. And so, like that whole, there is
yeah,
a type of death that, when you are the maiden first time out, that is, you can be self-absorbed, focused on like education or, establishing yourself, figuring out who you are. So
yeah,
in Persephone's story, in this version of it, there is the reprieve because we mentioned earlier about the committee that goes to bargain on her behalf. And then
mm,
Persephone does speak. And so this is Persephone talking about what happened with the pomegranate seeds, which were the temptation that she could not resist. That even though she had been saved from this difficult journey, that because she couldn't resist temptation, she ended up having to go on it anyway, even though everybody else tried to do the work for her and be like, we're just going to helicopter protect you from this. The bad thing has already happened, but we're just going to like put the nightlight on in your room when you're sleeping and try to fix it so you don't have to suffer and be a grown up. But then Persephone ate the pomegranate anyway. Like it talks about, like in Lampadia, their first assignment that they do is on like the necessity of Persephone's journey. Like, did she have to eat the pomegranate seed in order to become like a whole individual? Like, in order to like unite the different parts of herself, in order to become mature, she needed to experience great difficulty and learn to master like aspects of our own underworld, like our emotions and, like our shadow and all those kinds of things. So this is the explanation that she gives, which a couple of things, there's a lot of over explaining, which you pointed out earlier, can be a sign that it's like young people do that.
Yeah,
Too
yeah.
many words.
Wait, should we change slides? Should we show them?
Oh, you don't see the different slide?
No,
Well, that's weird.
I'm still seeing Peplos Corey.
Okay. What are you seeing now?
I'm seeing all of the presentation.
Okay.
Demeter.
What happened there? Okay.
Yeah.
There we go. Are we better now?
Yes.
Okay.
Perfect.
So we're on the like Persephone speaks and tells what happens part of the story.
Yeah.
So, and again, like something that could be going on here in terms of like, I'm not an expert in figuring out who wrote ancient texts, but to me, like reading this, when Persephone gets to talk, it's very like, let me tell you what happened. I'm going to give you all the details. And it becomes like first person. So I would say like maybe this is evidence that this actually was written down, recorded. I mean, obviously there were many different versions, but it was recorded by a woman, a younger woman, because like it becomes the first person and it's like, this is what happened. Here's the complete story. We were just minding our own business. There was a bunch of us hanging out. We were at the club doing the
She
things.
lists all her friends.
She lists all of her friends. It's kind of like everybody was there. We weren't doing anything. It's kind of like not to, it's some people see Persephone as a victim for obvious reasons, but like it's also like she's just explaining, over explaining.
Yeah.
I was completely innocent. All my friends were there. We were doing nothing. A lot of details, a lot of over explaining here.
Just picking flowers,
picking flowers. I don't know where that bottle of beer came from in my backpack, Mom. Right?
Pomegranate beer.
Pomegranate beer, right? So the story goes on, and this is just another excerpt that we wanted to highlight. So eventually, of course, like there's the deal brokered that Persephone indeed does need to go down to Hades town for a third of the year, be queen. She does all the things as queen, but then 2/3 of the year she gets to come back. So this makes Demeter super happy, unsurprisingly. And what she does is she bestows her sacred rights on Eleusis and on certain individuals in Eleusis. So this is, if you're watching, that is, I guess you'd call it a frieze with Triptolemos that I actually saw at the Met Museum. So if you are in a city where like that has big museums, you can probably go and see different representations of like this myth because it's so popular in art. And like from antiquity to today, you could go to any decent art museum and I'm sure you will find images of Demeter and Persephone. So the rituals are happening. Demeter is happy. Persephone is going to be coming back. Everything is good now. Demeter has accepted that her daughter is indeed a grown-up and has a right to be married, but not full time. She's going to come back. It's like Persephone has to go and do this thing, but then she's going to come back and all will be well. And Angela, I would love for you to read. So this is the last few lines of the hymn.
Sure. After divine Demeter laid out her rites, they left for Olympus to join the assembled gods. There they live with Zeus, who delights in thunder, revered and feared. Whoever Demeter and Persephone dearly love, of earthbound mortals, is greatly blessed. They send Plutos to that person's great house, and Plutos gives wealth to mortal folk. Come, goddesses who abide in incense offering Eleusis, Paros, surrounded by sea and craggy Antron, Queen Deo, who brings seasons, bears shining fruit, and your most beautiful daughter Persephone, gladly grant a welcome livelihood for my song. But I will remember you and the rest of the song.
It's so beautiful, and I love that it concludes with this idea of remembrance.
Mm.
You know, that like there is a need to acknowledge like the journey, acknowledge our personal journey, even though we've been transformed. And like Persephone, you know, we may be the above ground Persephone in our specific life cycle right now, where, you know, we've gone down below and done, like, we've had these difficult experiences and then gone in an intentional way and, you know, done the work so that we can emerge into like individuation, which is becoming wholly unto ourselves. And in a sense, becoming that reborn maiden or the Persephone above ground, where we've kind of gone through the phases and now we are coming back up for air, literally, and creating, like intentionally designing a life. Whereas before, I think when we were younger, maybe we were like Persephone and life just happened to us.
Yeah, yeah.
Um, and we know very little, like there's very little recorded mythology about above ground Persephone. Again, using that to delineate between her as Corey before she had her time down below. And now she is the queen of the like she's queen, but she's
Yeah,
coming
yeah, there's
back
a lot
up.
to, she decides like who lives, who dies. There's a lot to be said about like Persephone, queen of the dead, right? Like Persephone, queen of the underworld. She makes good with the power that she's given, definitely. But yeah, like there's not a lot said about like what happens that 2/3 of the year when she's back above ground, because she's not the same person she was when she left. She decides now like who lives and who dies. Like what's that like when she's like back home with mom, basically.
Right? And with the rest of the fam up on Olympus. And
Mm-hmm.
her children, because now even though she is like above ground Persephone, if we wanted to try to like make this into a narrative about our individual lives, instead of the glorious, messy, different myths piecing them together, where, you know, of course, like they're all different and competing, but in most of the stories, like Persephone does have children.
Yeah.
And you know, so she has this, she's back with the family, she's in Olympus, so she's ascended, like in a, I think in a modern sense, like when we talk about spirituality, like, and we talk about like maybe psycho spiritual upgrades, it's like, well, what is the point? Like, we're doing all of this work, we're meditating, doing ritual, studying, doing all the things that we do
Mm.
so we can like become Persephone reborn and have a life that is whole, that we're curious, that we're creative, that like the past is something that we're not chained to, but we are remembering it. So
Yeah.
if we're trying to go on this journey, which again I would say is not the opposite of a hero's journey, because it's
Mm.
like we want to be whole, we don't want to just keep, but here we are, we're at this stage in our journey, and now we feel like we can, you know, our own version of Mount Olympus, what that might look
Yeah.
like.
This is interesting though, this idea of wholeness, because I think that we pursue this in lots of ways. And I think it's also one of the things that you expect, like after a big ritual cycle, you know, like you go through the gate of rebirth, like here I am, I'm whole. But the interesting thing about the Persephone story is she's not whole in the way that you fantasize about. You know, she's negotiating with these two, in many ways, different lives. Um, and she always will be for all eternity. And in one life, like she has power over life and death, and she gives birth to the Furies, and don't eat her food, and like
Don't
it's a
take
whole,
her makeup.
yeah, exactly. And on the other side of it, she's just you don't really know, like she's just back home with her mom. Like I don't think, if any of you can relate to this, like how it feels like even when you're like 40 or whatever, going back home to your parents, like the dynamics of who you were as a child remain the same, like, and your siblings still rib you. And it's just, like nobody cares that you're famous, like in the universe of insurance or whatever.
Right?
Yeah, like how do you negotiate that? Like you're not going to, I mean, you say it all the time, like she comes home and like you don't get a parade. Like
It's like, oh, you've done all this transformative work. That's
yeah,
wonderful.
yeah. Oh, you're queen of the underworld? Gosh.
That's right.
Like
Oh, you've spent months in, like in Lymphadia doing all of this deep interior work, and like it's flowing over into how you navigate the exterior, which is really like Persephone reborn, right? It's like, okay, we've done all this interior work. So now how do we apply that to the exterior, to the solar, now that we're
mm,
coming up for air?
mm,
Um, and it's like people might not be happy
yeah.
that you've changed, like there is a status quo that you will be disrupting when you come back up. Because we could also take on like imagine Demeter's perspective, where she's like, I just got used to how things were and now she's back,
Yeah. And
right?
she's got these kids called the Furies. Like, I don't know
And
if I
Zagreus, who is also maybe Dionysus, like, could you imagine?
do
Like
you think
we've
that
all had
Demeter
house
relates
guests
to
that
them as
showed up with their kids who were like, I don't know about these kids, but could you imagine
yeah.
if the Furies and potentially Dionysus were staying in, we're in child form, hanging out with you at
Like,
summer
do you think
vacation
Demeter's like
in your
a
spare
doting
bedroom,
grandmother?
right?
Yeah, like the Persephone that we know after all of this happens, she's in many ways, like in terms of her power and the type of mother she becomes, like if you're looking at her children, are so like it's so different from her mother. Her mother is like golden wheat, and my daughter is like Corey the shoot. And like I don't know, like Demeter is a really specific mother figure, like the mother who did everything right. She, like I don't know, like Nicole Kidman would play her in the
Oh yes,
movie.
yes, yes, you're right. And win an Oscar, thank you.
Yeah, definitely. And like Persephone is just like, I don't know, like something like I don't know, it's a very like Winona Ryder situation.
Or maybe I think her name is Kristen Stewart.
Chris, no, are you thinking of Christina Ricci
No, I'm thinking of something like
from
someone from
Twilight?
like this century, not young. Like so, Christina Ricci and Winona Ryder were young like 30 years ago. I'm sorry, Angela.
They're
They're not
still
young.
young.
They're like
They're
my age, though.
they're
I'm not.
young to me.
They're young to you. They're nobody's Persephone in 2022. I'm trying to think of someone that is actually young today.
Why is Nicole Kidman okay? Like,
Well, she's like older than me. She could totally be Demeter. Meryl
fine.
Streep is too old. Meryl Streep is Hecate.
Okay, Meryl. Oh
Okay,
yes,
so we got to cast them. So Meryl
I could
Streep
say with
is
a
playing
Devil Wears
Hecate.
Prada outfit. Yes.
Oh no. Better than that would be what's that British actress who's so awesome?
Right, the one who's in the James Bond movies.
Yeah. What's her name?
Hold on, we have to look.
All right. So what if we're going for
Judi Dench.
Judi Dench is Hecate. Um, Nicole Kidman is Demeter. Kristen
Mhm.
Stewart, she was in the Twilight movies and she's in that
Yeah. Okay,
Diana
yeah,
movie. I think
yeah.
she could make a good,
Oh, she was so good in Diana.
so
Mhm.
good in Diana. But she's old enough that she could have these kids because you got to remember she's got the Furies, she's got Zagreus. There's a lot happening when she comes back.
She's
But she
got
is
William.
also like growing into herself, knowing
Yeah,
who she is. Sorry.
this is
If this offends any of the people who we're talking about would ever listen to this, but if you're a fan of them and this offends you, we don't apologize. We're just
yeah.
talking. There's no need to apologize.
You
We're
can
talking.
come up with your own actor classification if you
Yeah.
want.
So we'll do one of the key questions in Covina this month is like, who are you identifying with right now? Like in this story, are you like Hecate, Auntie Crone? It's not her story. She's there to help out, make sure things go as good as they can. Demeter, who is like, well, this isn't actually my story either, but my heart's broken. And then Persephone, who's like, this is my story. This is
Mm,
my journey. It's also like Demeter has her own separate, her story of separation. Like she has her story, Persephone has her story. So I think it's really interesting, like to explore from like the multiple perspectives in the Homeric hymn to Demeter. Of course, in the Metamorphoses, like it's told in a different style, but
mm,
um, but so there's Demeter and then there's Persephone, and now they're reunited. And in our research, looking for different myths that specifically talked about like above ground Persephone,
mm,
there's little, but there is this kind of strange story that I've tried to verify, and you've tried to, like, where does this story come from?
yeah.
Is it actually like where can we find this in like actual published scholarly translations of myths? I haven't been able
Mm,
to find it yet. So if you're watching and you actually know where this comes from and you can point us to like where it is, that would be
please.
great. So there's
Yeah.
this story of Persephone and the bull, which
Mm.
is, say it for me, like
Saris,
Ceres
Karis,
or Chorus?
Karis,
Paris?
Saris.
Okay. So you want to tell a story?
Sure.
Okay.
If if you no, yeah, like that there it's a very strange story because it's almost a fragment of a story. And again, like if you know where it comes from, please tell us. So the understanding is that Ceres is this white bull. He's causing a lot of havoc. Nobody knows where he comes from. He's just like tearing up crops and scaring people. He's way too big. A lot of people think like it might be a god of some kind. Um, and he's just a big problem. He's just a big white bull that's just roving through the countryside. But he encounters above ground Persephone in passing, and there's something about her that calms him. Like maybe they have a conversation, and thereafter they develop this kind of relationship. So the 2/3 of the year that she's above ground, like needing to seed, he lets her ride his back, and he just sort of like, like bulls her around. And in the 1/3 of the year, when she's underground again, he enters the sky and becomes Taurus. The like there are a few, yeah, interesting qualities about this story. Like the white bull theme is really interesting.
Mm.
Like it obviously brings to mind Zeus and Europa. Like that's a really easy parallel to make, like Europa being abducted by Zeus as a bull, and also Persephone riding this bull. And in fact, like there are stories that suggest these two bulls are the same. That somehow like when Zeus the bull like completed like his story with Europa, this particular myth, Zeus and the bull somehow became two different entities,
Mm-hmm.
and the bull goes on like roving around until he finds Persephone, and they develop this friendship. And it also reminds me a lot of the ancient story of Inanna and Eresh Kigal. Like in Gilgamesh, like there's this whole drama involving a holy white bull who's like unleashed, and he dies. And it's all Inanna's fault. It's a big issue.
Mm.
And it's one of the reasons why Inanna and Eresh Kigal have beef, like why Eresh Kigal flays and kills her, because the white bull was her husband. So this idea of like the divine white bull and his marriage to the death goddess, the goddess who lives under the earth, like there's a very close relationship there. And of course, there's Pasiphae, and the bull the holy white bull, in Minos, that she has sex with, and produces the Minotaur. So there are all of these. There's something. There's some kind of like incredibly simpatico relationship between between women and mythology. Like sometimes it's not always a relationship, right? Like with Zeus and Europa, we're definitely like, yeah, it was just Zeus being a creeper, like he's always being. But in these other stories, it's like it's more consensual. There's like a two-sided thing happening um between white bulls, like that are considered holy, all the way back to Sumer, and a particular type of woman. Like Pasiphae was very much associated with what's like considered darker arts.
Mhm.
But also like Uresh Kigal, like Persephone, is a death goddess, like an underworld goddess. So, I mean, it's also the very old story of something divine and from above falling in love with what's essentially the earth, right? Like I think that's the oldest myth we have, like the sky falling in love with the earth, and the embodiments are two different things.
Right, or the moon falling in love with the sun, like the relationship, and and then the earth is the child of the moon. So there's so much there. I think we definitely need to do some kind of episode on Pasiphae and the bull and Ariadne. I know that's not like part of the schedule for this year, but I'm like, oh, we need to just
Yeah, I think it would be worth it. Yeah,
talk
yeah.
about that.
We never talk about them. Pasiphae and Ariadne don't get a lot of play. It's
No,
true.
so we should do, and just like Semele doesn't get a lot of play. And there is also the Dionysus connection there, with
Yeah,
Ariadne. So it's
Ariadne.
like maybe we can do an episode on Pasiphae, she's just so fascinating, a mythic character. And then the Minotaur. Okay, so
Mm.
I think we have. So usually when we start veering into other myths, we know the time has come to an end, that the myth is done visiting us for the day. And so I hope you've enjoyed this exploration of above ground Persephone. If you are listening or watching this and you're not in Covina, and you're thinking you might want to go deeper into exploring these things and weaving psychology into the myths, and also with practical uh, crafting, like we do magical talismans and things every month, you can find out more about all of that at keepingherkeys.com. Bye.
Bye.